So good to see you, Dancha.
It's so lovely to connect here. And for me, it's really going back to the beginning. We've known each other for many years, but when I was approached by women who had been uh, sexually abused by their Buddhist teacher and was trying to figure out with them what's the path forward, we went to visit you and received orientation, and you gave us so much guidance that has carried through until now. And I think one of the things that makes me really actually kind of excited to talk to you is that you probably are the only person, certainly the only person that I know of, who is both a teacher, a Buddhist teacher in her own right with her own community, a very serious advocate and ally who has done a lot of work around the topic of abuse. And you also are drawing on your own personal experience, having experienced that at the hands of your own teacher. And we have the article that you wrote, Breaking the Silence, now translated into Spanish. And we'll be sharing the link to it in the description of this video for people to read your reflections on that as well. And the last session that we had I was interviewing Anne Gleig and Amy Langenberg, they were talking about how important it was and how rare that really you were the only person who had, at that point, who had openly come out and was speaking about the experiences. So you sort of have a pivotal role in the whole movement towards shedding light on this phenomenon, finding ways to talk about it, and thinking very seriously, how can we prevent this from being experienced by other people in Buddhist communities? Um, so it's just really exciting. And you also have done very, very serious 3-year retreats, two of them, am I right? Two of them in the Karma Kagyu tradition. And so there's just like a lot of synergies that are really good to have in play when we're talking about a topic that is so difficult to think about, to feel about, and also to hear about.
It is a difficult topic, Dancha, and I just want to express my gratitude for your bringing the topic up because sometimes we think that by talking about the difficult, it's going to be more difficult somehow, and yet the abuse thrives in the environment of silence. And so if we don't talk about it, we're creating a field for for that to arise. And the only way that we can really start to heal abuse is by bringing it to light, right? We have to bring it to light before it can be healed. Um, or, in the words of the Buddha, we have to see our suffering before we can free our suffering. Before we can become free from suffering, we have to see first. First noble truth, suffering. We have to become intimate. So we have to become intimate with what is this, and then we can free it. So thank you for bringing it to the table.
Mhm. Well, I think you put it on the table first for all of us. And I'm just really happy to be following that example. I think for me, one of the starting points is to recognize that this is not a case of one or two teachers gone astray. This is not a case of one or two bad apples. Abuse is coming to light in all forms of Buddhism, in all lineages of Buddhism, at all different levels of the hierarchies that we can find. And what this says is that there are conditions that are being reproduced in Buddhist communities and in the relationships that we have with one another and with our teacher that are making it possible, that are conducive or enabling abuse. And at the same time, even if it were a question of a few bad apples, what do we do with bad apples? You remove them from the bucket because they, are creating a condition around themselves where it's okay to do that. They're normalizing abuse. And so we sort of are, I think, just to look at ourselves, we are at a point where abuse by Buddhist teachers of their students has been, to a certain degree, normalized. It's not spoken of. It goes on. And for all of us who are practicing in Buddhist communities, that's for me, a big red flag that we are reproducing conditions that apparently include the conditions that allow abuse to continue. And we're not doing the work of addressing it, which could protect the people who are suffering from abuse. And I want to ask you, I know you've thought about this deeply for a very long time from all these different angles that you're able to bring to bear. And could you talk about how it is in a practice context? And we can speak specifically about Tibetan Buddhism since that's what we both have been trained in. What is it about the Tibetan Buddhist practice context that either makes abuse difficult to detect, that people are groomed, that is to say they're prepared, they have their boundaries crossed, and so grooming, as a general phenomenon, that way in which, something will be done that one feels a little invasive, but either it's done as a joke, and so you don't know whether it's appropriate to, say that wasn't okay, or it's done a little bit and then it's brushed off, and you're accustomed to having more and more boundary violations, and then that is the moment when you have been groomed to not even recognize that there is a question of consent, for example, that you just it seems like maybe it's okay, you don't know. And so could you talk about ways that the practice context or the relationship with Buddhist teachers can be a mask for grooming behaviors? Can you describe how that happens? Mm-hmm. And what the conditions are that make that possible?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the conditions is a power dynamic between the teacher and the student, where the teacher is elevated really above the human realm to a status of divine or Buddha-like, Buddha or Buddha-like, and a student that is still in the realm of samsara or sentient being, the category of sentient being, and sometimes that dynamic is actually articulated. Oh, the teacher is the Buddha, and you're doing prostrations to some image in which the teacher has been invited. Like we invite the teacher into the Chenrezig or into a primordial Buddha figure, and then we do our practice, right? We prostrate to that, or we invite that to send its blessings, or so there's something about the practices in Himalayan traditions that elevates the teacher. And I'm not saying that isn't a skillful means that could work, but I'm very suspicious of it now, having gone through what I've gone through. I think that if we're to continue to carry on these practices, we have to be very careful to articulate that teachers are fallible and human, and really make that a very strong part of our Dharma culture, because Otherwise, it's this power dynamic, and the power dynamic is what makes is one of the conditions that makes abuse so easy. Because if you're a teacher and you have that status, you're a Buddha or a Buddha-like figure, then in the mind of the student, your actions hold greater weight and are expressing greater wisdom than their actions. So if you're looking to your teacher for guidance around your spiritual practice, and you've been told or you've been groomed to believe that your teacher is infallible, then whatever they tell you to do, you must do. And whatever they suggest, whatever decisions they suggest that you make, you should make. And if you don't make them, you're not listening to the voice of wisdom. You're not listening to the voice of the Buddha somehow. And so you're actually being a bad student if you do that. And that's an unfair choice, right, for anyone to have to make, to either be a good student and follow the words of the teacher, or be a bad student and follow your own internal wisdom, right? So, so I think there's something about the power dynamic that we have to be very, very conscious of in the Buddhist community, and that we all need to be educated about, so that if there's anything that the teacher does that goes against our internal wisdom, that we listen to the internal wisdom. And we doesn't mean we can't respect the teacher. We could respect the teacher, but we could respectfully say, this is not okay, and bring it to light, be transparent about it. So, so that's one of the conditions that I think predisposes the Buddhist community to abuse. And that also gets to the question of structure, that our Buddhist communities need to be structured in a way that the teacher is not all powerful. Because if they become all powerful, then abuse is imminent.
Apart from that, I'm also just thinking other ways outside the teacher-student relationship that what you described is being supported, where all of the wisdom is on the teacher side. It's very dualistic sort of relationship, like they're the good one, they're the wise one, we're the ones needing guidance, we're the ones needing blessings. And there's also all of the teachings on non-self, where we're encouraged to, distrust our ego, or think that, anything that's self-centered is unhealthy or is non-virtuous. We are trying to, doubt the self, dissolve the self, transcend the self, dismantle the self. And so that does place us in this very disempowered position where we feel like, if we speak out for ourselves, if we assert our own boundaries, we are being self-centered. And, both of us have, lived each different years, but we've both lived years as monastics. And that kind of role of, how it's, bad to be ego-centered and you should be, you should serve, it connects with gender, roles, it connects with the monastic roles. And then you also have the ideology where we are, working with the notion of self in a way that can lead to a lot of self-doubt. Have you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I think in some ways the whole selfless ideology of Buddhism needs some updating. And I think that the field of psychology in conversation with Buddhism has a lot to offer with updating the what does it mean to be a healthy human being. Our Western psychology has thought a lot about that, written a lot about that. There's a lot of writings on that. There's a lot of material on that. And I think some of that material is backed up by science. And so I think that saying that there's no self what we often hear as students is that we should erase all of our impulses and desires and give up our agency for the betterment of the whole. And whether or not that is the message that is intended, there is something in that message that erodes our sense of agency and decision-making power can potentially, and you know, as a monastic, that you have to give up some agency in order to contribute to the monastic body becomes an extension of your own body. And then you have to, in order to even live in that environment, you do have to give up some of your personal desires and personal wishes. But I think we tend to do that too much. And we actually need to be healthy human beings. We need a healthy self to hang our hat on. And we can, what the Buddha meant, I am sure the Buddha had a personality. Of course he did, right? The Buddha, it wasn't like the Buddha had no self. He may not have been attached to that self, but he had something there, right? He spoke, he taught, he joked, he was an activist. We can see that from the early Buddhist teachings. He had a personality. So I take some teaching from that, not just from the doctrine, but how is that doctrine expressed? It's expressed through the lens of a human being. And so we need to remember that we have to have a healthy self to hang our hat on. It's not about erasure. It's about realizing that the healthy self that we have may be a construction, but it is an important construction. It needs good boundaries. It needs self-care, and it needs to be deeply heard and listened to. And I think as monastics, we don't really get that side of things. So that side of things can come to us through maybe through a skillful teacher, right? If we have a skillful teacher, or if not, through the field of psychology and what it has to offer about working with developing a healthy self.
I'm thinking also about when all of this is manifesting in a collective context, the collective context of Buddhist communities. You know, when we think about the grooming behavior taking place between student and teacher, but actually the entire collective or the entire context can, be communicating and can be functioning together to reinforce some of these misunderstandings or some of these unhealthy dynamics. And I wonder if you could, share or reflect on some of the ways in which Buddhist communities as a whole end up participating in either the grooming or certainly the normalization or the cover-up of behavior that in any other context would, quite probably be recognized very quickly as abusive.
Mm-hmm.
What is the role of Buddhist communities here?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the problems in Buddhist communities is there aren't many forums for listening to all voices, and some voices are louder than others, and especially the voice of the teacher, right? Everyone's listening for that voice of the teacher, and the voice of the students is often only valued for the questions that it asks of the teacher, as opposed to valued for its own wisdom. So one of the ways that Buddhist communities can help change that is by creating forums like the practice of counsel, in which there's a non-hierarchical opportunity for all voices in the community to be heard, for example. So I think that Buddhist communities get into a rut with not having enough collective wisdom, not mining enough of the collective wisdom. And to mine the collective wisdom takes a lot of effort and attention and work. You have to actually create structures that are circular and that listen to small groups, listen to the voices of small groups, collect that wisdom, and actually begin to steer the whole community based on a collective wisdom, not on a centralized wisdom coming from just centralized wisdom, coming from just one source. So I don't know, it's one of many things that I could say, but what that means, right, if all the wisdom is coming from one source, is that if a student, so for example, in my own community, when I was in a situation, when I was in a relationship with my own teacher, a sexual relationship that was kept secret, my secrecy was encouraged, mandated by the teacher. I didn't see even any forum or opportunity in which I could bring up what was happening to me. There was no outlet. And had there been a council in which the community came together once a week to talk about whatever was really happening with them, I would probably have revealed that at a much earlier time than I did. And so when I think back on those days, not having the forum and not having an example of people in the community listening to each other, that was just not something that happened. It was, we were listening to the teacher. We weren't listening to each other as a practice.
And that happens on a personal level, but also we have these Buddhist spaces tend to be spaces that are completely controlled by the teacher. There's a retreat center that's controlled by the teacher where all the interactions among students and with the teacher are all being shaped. You know, the board of directors are loyal to the teacher. And we have this, the structure and the ideology basically that the teacher is a repository of wisdom and sort of the representative of the Buddha fulfilling those functions for us, that we end up having not just completely hierarchical, but very unidirectional relationships where we're not really encouraged very much. Go call them your Vajra brother and sister, but that's not the main relationship that you have. This idea that, and here the idea of Samaya, I think might be interesting to explore, that Samaya as a sacred bond or a sacred commitment that arises in the context of a specific relationship. And we think about Samaya, usually we think about Samaya in terms of, that we have to follow the instructions of the teacher and that we have to obey the teacher and we have to see the teacher as, much wiser than we are. And, everything they do is going to help us get rid of the parts of ourself that are an obstacle, such as ourself. And then in your article, you talk about how the fact that this is a two-way bond, and one of the women that I know who was sexually assaulted by her teacher, investigated because she was concerned about the question of Samaya, like, can I talk about it? What do I do about it? Do I tell anyone? I don't want to break this sacred bond that I have with the teacher. And she researched with some very learned scholars, Geshe is trained traditionally in her tradition. And they said, no, you don't have to worry about it, because by treating you in that way, they've already broken their Samaya. And I also investigated with other Tibetan scholars that I really respect with a deep traditional training. And I heard that also, but this is not at all how we understand the obligations in those relationships, much less recognize that we also have Samaya, with our fellow practitioners, the people who we're sharing a community with. I wonder if you could, share some of your own thoughts about, what this sacred bond that we have with one another and we have with everything finally, but this particular form, and how it gets used as a means of silencing or preparing us to accept abuse or to not recognize that it's happening.
Yes, yes. So Samaya is one of those doctrines that can be so misused, because it's Samaya means sacred bond, and I think that many people understand that to be your job is to hear and everything that comes from your teacher as being the words of the Buddha, and your job to keep your Samaya. You have to be blind to their potential faults or vulnerabilities. And I'm just going to say right out, I disagree with that reading of that doctrine. I think that Samaya, meaning sacred bond, is about having each other's best interests at heart, which means that the teacher needs to have, the teacher's Samaya is to have your best interest at heart as a student. And to the Samaya of the teacher is to guard boundaries. They have a greater, because of their power, this power dynamic, they have a greater responsibility than the student to hold the integrity of those boundaries. The student's responsibility is to be vulnerable, to offer up their experience, and that vulnerability is a sacred thing. So if the teacher takes advantage of those vulnerabilities, that is a breaking of the Samaya. And actually, we find that in these cases of abuse, most of the time, the student is going through something that makes them even more vulnerable. Like they've just lost a parent, or they have just had a tragedy or a crisis happen in their own life. It's at those moments, it tends to be at those moments, that the teacher takes advantage. So there's something about vulnerability that is sacred, and to take advantage of that vulnerability, to let those boundaries erode, is a Samaya breaking on the part of the teacher. So I actually see abuse as a breaking of Samaya. It's a breaking of Samaya, not on the part of the student, on the part of the teacher. And I want to take this one opportunity right now to say, while we have this opportunity to have the conversation, that abuse hides. So abuse hides. That's one of the characteristics of abuse. It hides behind a veil of silence and secrecy. And if those things are there, if secrecy is there, a mandated secrecy, there's probably abuse going on. And I say that for the purposes of any survivors that may be listening to this conversation, that the presence of a mandate of secrecy is probably the sign that whatever is going on, it's not okay. And so I mention that because myself, I never would have characterized myself as a victim. And I actually still don't. I still can't put myself in the category of victim. I could put myself in the category of survivor. That feels more dignified to me than victim. So most people cannot even go to that category in their minds, people that have been survivors of abuse. And nor do abusers think of themselves as abusers. I think this is really important to say while we're having this conversation, because abuse hides, and the dynamic that's happening when people are in it, the abuser doesn't think I'm an abuser, and the victim doesn't think I'm a victim. So we'll often just ignore things that are going on because we're like, it couldn't possibly be abuse. In my community is a good community. Like, we tend to think that way, that somehow we're going to be, we're not going to be in that category. And people that it happens to don't see themselves in that category. So we actually have to step back and ask ourselves this question: is harm occurring? Is psychological harm occurring? Is physical harm occurring? Is emotional harm occurring? If it is, that needs to be brought to light. And you can forget about the labels, figure out the labels later. But harm may be occurring. And often the harm is invisible until later, especially with abuse. You can think it's okay, and then slowly your sense of emotional stability is eroding, because you're being told it's okay by the person who is enacting the abuse.
And I just want to, bring to bear a little bit something that, maybe for people who are just coming to Buddhism or to Tibetan Buddhism might not have heard of or be so aware of, is that there are a lot of ideologies or teachings around ways in which having a sexual relationship with a teacher is understood to be, a blessing, or understood to be a path to awakening for the student. And those can also mask the type of relationship that people are engaged in. Could you talk about how framing what, to the outside or stripped of the ideological apparatus might look like, someone just imposing their will or manipulating someone into serving their sexual needs, or outright rape, which also happens? How is it that the teachings or the understanding of intimate relationships as a path to enlightenment can confuse the nature of the relationship that one is having imposed on one or being pulled into?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there is this doctrine of sacred relationship in Buddhism, and for some of us, that's partly what drew me to Buddhism initially. Was those images of Yabyum. I'm in my 20s and looking for meaning in life, right? You're in your 20s looking for meaning in life. And to see an image that depicts relationship as a path to awakening, it's very compelling, very compelling. And so those sacred relationships exist in the history of Buddhism as the consorts, right, of these teachers. And sometimes the teachers were women and they had consorts, right? So there is this history of that kind of sacred relationship and that framing. And I think for our time and place, it's not that we can't practice sacred relationship. We can practice sacred relationship, and that can be a part of our path. But when there's a very clear power dynamic of one person more powerful making the decision and calling the shots, and someone less powerful and serving and acquiescing, that is not a partnership of consent. And so my response to your question is, I think abuse is very much relies on this power dynamic. And so if that power dynamic can be evened out in a relationship, if two people practice Buddhism together and they want to see their relationship as a sacred bond, as a part of their path, that's a beautiful thing. But if that relationship begins with a teacher and a student, it's going to be problematic. It's going to be problematic. And it's going to be subject to that same problem of consent. Can you really give consent when the person more powerful than you, a lot more powerful than you, is putting that on top of you? And my conclusion is not really, no. unless that power dynamic evens out, that can't really occur.
And there are specific guidelines that some communities have created, ethical guidelines to guide a teacher and a student who might have fallen in love. You know, here
Yes.
I'm not talking about the, forcing, sexual subservience on the other person, but where there is that sort of emotional relationship that's mutual. Can you describe some of those guidelines? What should be done in those situations? Because you're describing a context in which, within Buddhism, having a relationship with a partner, who's also practicing together can be part of the path. And so that sort of makes you wonder then what's wrong with these other relationships. So what is the transition?
Yeah. So there have been guidelines, written to recognize that things happen. So even though we may be keeping the boundaries, things happen, right? And if something is about to happen, you could read these guidelines on the website of Spirit Rock, for example. Spirit Rock has guidelines, and we do too in Natural Dharma Fellowship, ethical guidelines written out that include a clause on, okay, so what happens if a student and a teacher are attracted to each other? And the protocol that we've put into place, that Spirit Rock, we use Spirit Rock's guidelines as a template because it seemed reasonable to us to have a clause like that in there. The teacher and the student need to actually step away from that role and not be teacher-student anymore, and not see each other for a period of time, and then come back together as equals, not as teacher-student. So the teacher has to renounce being that person's teacher, and the student has to renounce being that person's student. And then they come back together on equal terms and negotiate the terms of their relationship from there. I think that's a good way to proceed. I do think that's a good way to proceed. Realistically, it could be, and often is, that one person in a partnership is more knowledgeable about the Dharma than the other person. And so it may be that they function as that person's, they need a relationship first, right? But there may be some exchange of knowledge and guidance in any relationship. And that person, the student will be a teacher, or the person who's less knowledgeable in the Dharma will be a teacher to that person in some other way. So I'm not saying that those things couldn't work. They could work, but it has to be done carefully. Yeah. We've all made mistakes in our past. I've made so many mistakes in my past too, around those things, and feeling, we do the best we can.
How prevalent do you think teacher abuse is in the Buddhist community?
I suspect it is very prevalent, and that most cases of abuse go unreported, and that what we see in the media and in the cases that we actually hear about is just a portion of what's actually happening. And I think part of the reason we don't hear about it is that it is so hard for people to come forward. And it takes so much energy, support, and courage to do that. And also that Buddhist communities, when people do know about it, they don't always do the investigative part, follow up on it. And so my hope is that with more people talking about it, and with conversations like this one, that more teachers who were once abused themselves, Buddhist teachers, might come forward and talk more about their experience, and that and that students who are currently in those situations might find the support to come forward. It can help all of us.
And can I just ask what makes you suspect that it is that widespread? I mean, I share your suspicion, but I would just like to hear.
Well, as you know, I've had my fingers in a number of different, hearing a lot of these stories firsthand in the last few years, based partly on the article and partly just on life circumstance. And many of those haven't been really come fully to light, those stories. So it that helps me understand that much of what's happening isn't fully, it's just a small percentage that we're aware of. And also just, privately shared stories between teachers, and my growing suspicion that many of us who are now Buddhist teachers have had our own personal experiences with boundary violations. And I happen to write about mine, but most people haven't written about theirs or come forward in the first person voice to talk a little bit more about their own experience. And I hope that there room will be made for that in the Buddhist community. And I like to call those stories, lately I've been thinking of them as shadow stories, that we might come to actually embrace the beauty and the importance of hearing shadow stories, not just as a kind of isn't that terrible? Isn't that disillusioning? But more, isn't that vulnerable? And isn't that brave? And can't we learn from that kind of vulnerability how to be that open and courageous ourselves?
Yeah, I have to say, in so many of the situations where, survivors will find the strength inside themselves and find the courage and act based on a very sincere and real concern for the well-being of future victims of abuse, wanting to protect other people from experiencing the same thing. And they will come to that point where they know they're going to get pushback, and they know there could be reprisals, and they are very likely to be shamed, and they could be bullied, and they may lose their place in their community. And they overcome all of those fears, and for the well-being of the community and other victims, they speak. And I think those are the people we want to have at the center of our community. Whereas the community's response normally is to circle the wagons around the teacher and marginalize those people. And so often I've thought, the most inspiring examples of a courageous bodhisattva act, or a courageous act of commitment to the truth and of willingness to act for the welfare of others, are the people who are becoming vulnerable and speaking for the benefit of others. And what would our communities be like if we really valued that, rather than valued loyalty to the institution or the things that we end up putting at the center in our response to these situations?
Yes, absolutely. And what those stories surface is that the teachers are human and fallible. And I think to see that is not disappointing. To me, it's actually a relief. So they're human, they make mistakes, and those mistakes can be egregious. But if we take that principle in general, that our teachers are multidimensional and they're human and they're fallible, then we're discovering that this thing that we call and think of as so exalted and beyond, called enlightenment, is coming through these very complicated crystals of human experience. And we can really have a healthier relationship with our future teachers. If maybe not with the same teacher that perpetrated this terrible thing, but if we can understand all teachers are human, then our relationship with our teachers becomes different. It becomes deeper, it becomes more complex, and it becomes more real and rich. like, I don't want a relationship with a pedestal, like with this thing up on a pedestal. That seems unattainable. And now I know it's unhealthy. I'm much more interested in a relationship with a human being. So,
well, especially once we have our teacher on a pedestal, we are always their inferior, always, because they're up there and we're down here. Mm-hmm. And it's, it's one of the things, when I gave back my monastic vows, that was one of the things I had in mind, that, as teachers, there's so many ways that the institution or the kinds of teachings that we've heard incline us to put the teachers on a pedestal. Monasticism, feeds into that, being a religious authority, and then we fear authority and we resent authority. It sets up a lot of unhelpful dynamics in that relationship. And, through our dualistic thinking, the teacher is the one who knows, and I'm the one who doesn't, and so that moment of recognizing that our teachers are really flawed, and somehow, the Dharma is still finding its channels to work through them. I like so much your way of thinking of it. And I think that's really true and useful.
One of the many gems that gets forged in the fire of all this stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Awakening gets forged. It gets forged in the messiness, in the complexity of interdependent reality. So,
well, thank you so much, Damsha, for having me on in the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah.